I'm a 31-year-old insurance agent, and after a long week of dealing with policies, claims, and endless phone calls, I enjoy wandering through other people's cast-offs. I love coming across things that seem to carry their own little tale, something you can breathe new life into. Last month, on a Saturday morning, I was driving through a nearby neighborhood when I spotted a sign for a yard sale. It was one of those last-minute detours, the kind where you don't expect to find much, but end up stopping anyway. The house was modest, with a folding table set up on the driveway, and a few random items scattered around, books, kitchen gadgets, and a collection of tools that immediately caught my eye. Among the tools was a rusty, old-school red metal toolbox. It reminded me of the one my grandfather used to have in his garage when I was a kid. I could almost smell the motor oil and sawdust just looking at it. I opened it up and saw a few random tools inside. A couple of wrenches, some screwdrivers, and an old hammer with a worn wooden handle. Nothing fancy, but it felt like a little piece of nostalgia. "How much for this?" I asked the man running the sale, holding up the toolbox. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. $10, he said, shrugging like it was no big deal. I said, handing over the cash. We chatted for a minute or two about tools and how they don't make them like they used to. Then I carried the toolbox to my car and headed home, happy with my find. A week later, I'd almost forgotten about the toolbox. It was sitting in my garage, waiting for me to clean it up and maybe use it to organize some of my own tools. One evening, as I was finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I wiped my hands on a towel and headed to the door. Standing on my porch was a man I didn't recognize. He was probably in his late 40s, with a wiry build, short brown hair, and a face that looked like it had seen its fair share of trouble. He wasn't threatening exactly, but something about his presence felt oppressive. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping the door only half open. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "You bought a toolbox at a yard sale last week, right?" I stared for a moment, surprised. Yeah? Why?" "It's mine," he said, leaning slightly closer. "It got sold by mistake. I need it back. Now, this didn't sit right with me. The man at the yard sale hadn't mentioned anything about it belonging to someone else, and even if it had been a mistake, I'd paid for it fair and square. Still, I tried to be polite. "I'm sorry, but I bought it from the owner. Are you sure it's the same one?" "It's the same one," he insisted. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just need my toolbox back." I held back for a second, sure there was more to it than he let on. "I'm sorry," I said again, firmer this time. "I bought it legally. If there's an issue, maybe you should talk to the guy who sold it." He stared at me for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "All right," he said, turning to leave, "but I'll be back." True to his word, he came back. 2 days later, I was watching TV when the doorbell rang again. This time I didn't answer right away. I peeked through the peephole and saw him standing there, looking more agitated than before. "Hey!" he shouted, knocking harder. "I know you're in there. Just give me the toolbox and I'll leave you alone." I didn't respond. Something about his tone made me feel uneasy, like he wasn't just some guy looking to reclaim his property. After a few minutes, he gave up and left, but not before pacing back and forth on my porch like a caged animal. The visits continued over the next few days, each one more intense than the last. He'd show up at random times, early in the morning, late at night, and pound on the door, yelling about the toolbox. Once, I heard him try the doorknob, and my stomach dropped as I realized I hadn't locked it. I quickly bolted it and called a friend. "Dude, this guy's unhinged," my friend said. "You need to call the cops." I was hesitant. He hadn't technically done anything illegal yet, and I didn't want to escalate the situation. But when he came back a week later and tried to force his way inside, I knew I couldn't just let it go. I needed to deal with it. It was late, around 10 p.m., and I was in the kitchen cleaning up when I heard the pounding on the door. This time, it wasn't just knocking. It was the sound of someone trying to shove the door open. "Open the door," he yelled. "I know you're in there." My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. As I waited for the operator, I grabbed a kitchen knife, my hands shaking. "I'm calling the police," I shouted through the door. "You need to leave." For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard him mutter something under his breath before retreating. I stayed on the line with the operator until the police arrived, explaining everything to the officer, who came to my door. "Do you know this guy?" the officer asked. "No," I said, "but he's been coming around for the past week, saying the toolbox I bought belongs to him." The officer nodded. "We'll file a report and keep an eye out. If he comes back, don't hesitate to call us." That night, I kept thinking about the toolbox, wondering why it was so important to him. Was it sentimental? Did it have something hidden inside? I went to the garage and opened it up, sifting through the tools one by one. Nothing seemed unusual, just the same old wrenches and screwdrivers I'd seen when I bought it. But then I noticed something odd. The bottom of the toolbox had a false panel. I pried it open with a screwdriver. I was stunned, breathless by what was hidden underneath. Inside were several small plastic bags filled with what looked like white powder. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. The man hadn't been after the toolbox. He'd been after his stash. The next morning, I took the toolbox straight to the police station and explained everything. The officer I spoke to seemed unsurprised, nodding grimly as he took my statement. "You did the right thing," he said. "We'll look into it, but I'd recommend being extra cautious for the next few weeks. If this guy knows you have his stash, he might not give up so easily." After leaving the police station, I tried to go about my day. Work, groceries, the usual. Life had to go on. It was late when I returned home. I couldn't stop thinking about all that had happened this past week. The officer I'd spoken with had been straightforward. Turning over the toolbox and its contents was the right move, but the man might not let things go so easily. They promised to investigate, but the officer's parting words stuck with me. "Be cautious." As I pulled into my driveway, something immediately felt wrong. The porch light, which I always left on, was off, leaving the front of my house in eerie darkness. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat and stepped out of the car, scanning the area. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open, the lock shattered and hanging loosely from the frame. A jolt of adrenaline shot through me as I froze, staring at the gaping doorway. For a moment, I debated calling the police again, but the urge to know what was happening in my own home was stronger. I dialed 911, keeping the operator on the line, and cautiously stepped inside. The scene was chaos. The living room looked like a tornado had blown through it. Cushions thrown from the couch, shelves emptied, and papers scattered everywhere. My heart pounded as I moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was no better. Every cabinet door hung open, dishes smashed on the floor, and even the contents of the fridge had been dumped onto the counter. As I turned down the hallway toward the bedrooms, I heard the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps. My pulse quickened, and I pressed myself against the wall, straining to listen. The back door slammed, and I caught a glimpse of two men sprinting into the backyard, disappearing into the shadows beyond my fence. I wanted to chase them, to yell, to do something, but fear rooted me to the spot. Instead, I waited a moment, making sure they were truly gone before continuing to survey the damage. My bedroom was completely trashed, closets yanked open, the mattress overturned, and every drawer pulled from the dresser and dumped onto the floor. It didn't take a detective to figure out what. They'd been after the toolbox. The police had it now, safely tucked away in an evidence locker. But those men didn't know that. They'd been watching me, waiting for me to leave so they could break in and retrieve it themselves. The realization sent a chill down my spine. These men weren't just petty thieves. They were desperate, willing to tear apart my house and risk getting caught to get their hands on their stash. and now they knew it was gone. The police arrived a short time later. I explained what had happened, describing the two men as best I could, though I hadn't seen their faces clearly in the dark. The officers took a report, checked the house, and assured me they'd increase patrols in the area. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts to stay calm. "It's possible," one of the officers admitted. "But now that they know the toolbox isn't here, either way, we'll keep an eye out. Make sure to install new locks and consider adding some cameras." The next few days, I had the locks replaced, installed a security system, and stayed with a friend while I tried to process everything. The sense of violation was overwhelming. My home, my safe space, had been invaded, and it was hard to shake the feeling that someone was still watching. I still find myself looking over my shoulder every time I come home, scanning for unfamiliar cars or figures lingering nearby. The police haven't updated me on their investigation, and I don't know if they ever caught the man from the yard sale or his accomplices. Thankfully, the man never came back. I don't know if the police caught him or if he decided the risk wasn't worth it. Either way, I was stuck in a constant state of paranoia, always checking behind me outside. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to think a yard sale could be so harmless. What started as a nostalgic purchase turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. When you work in IT, people assume you've got the latest gadgets and cutting-edge tech at home. But honestly, while I deal with advanced systems at work, my weekends are spent tinkering with old consoles, vinyl records, and VHS tapes. Rewinding a tape is one of those small, comforting rituals. Hearing that soft whirring sound and watching movies the way I did as a kid. So when I came across a yard sale with a box of tapes for only $5, it felt like hitting the jackpot. The sale was nothing special. The family who lived a few houses from mine was moving out and was getting rid of some old things. They had a few tables with mismatched items, and the man was sitting in a lawn chair, sipping iced tea. I wasn't even looking for anything specific, but the box of tapes caught my eye. Most of them were old classics. E.T., The Goonies, Back to the Future, nostalgic gold. But buried beneath them was an unmarked black tape. Its label peeled off, leaving a faint adhesive residue. It stood out, and I couldn't resist. I tossed the box in my trunk, ready to dive into a weekend of movie marathons. That night, after sorting through the tapes, I decided to save the unmarked one for last. It felt like opening a mystery box. You never know what you're going to get. Bootleg concert footage? A home video someone forgot about? Something weird and hilarious? The possibilities were endless. I popped the tape into my old VCR, grabbed a beer, and settled in. The static noise greeted me as the screen lit up and the footage began. It was grainy, like an old home movie shot on one of those clunky camcorders from the 80s or 90s. The image stabilized, showing a family, a man, woman, and two kids sitting in a cozy living room. They were laughing, talking, and passing around a bowl of popcorn. The sound was muffled, but it seemed like a normal family moment. At first, I thought nothing of it, just some random home video. But as I kept watching, something about the scene tugged at the back of my mind. The furniture arrangement, the wallpaper. It all felt familiar. I squinted at the screen, trying to place it, and then it hit me. The living room on the tape wasn't just familiar, it was mine. My house, my living room. I leaned closer to the screen. Sure enough, the layout matched perfectly. The couch positioned against the far wall, the old fireplace with a slightly chipped mantel, the small alcove where I kept my bookshelf. Even the faded floral wallpaper was unmistakable. But the tape looked like it was from decades ago, long before I'd moved in. I paused the tape and stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. My house had been built in the late 80s, and I'd bought it 5 years ago from an older couple who'd owned it for ages. Maybe this was footage of them? But no, the people on the tape were younger, probably in their 30s, and the kids looked around 8 or 9. I didn't remember seeing any photos of kids when I toured the house. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe this was a family who'd lived here before the older couple. I hit play again, determined to see how it played out. As the video continued, the family's laughter seemed to die down. The kids looked nervously toward the edge of the frame, and the parents exchanged tense looks. It was subtle at first, little shifts in their expressions, their body language, but soon it became clear that something had changed. The man whispered something to the woman, and she nodded, pulling the kids closer to her. My heart felt heavy as I watched, completely glued to what I was seeing. The camera panned slightly, revealing more of the room. Shadows flickered against the far wall, moving unnaturally, like they didn't belong to the people in the room. One of the kids pointed toward the hallway off to the side, and the woman shook her head, holding him tighter. The tape began to distort, the image flickering with static, but I could still make out faint whispers in the background. The family looked terrified, their eyes darting toward the hallway as if expecting something to appear. The camera suddenly jolted, as if the person filming had dropped it, and the screen filled with static for a moment. When the picture returned, the angle had shifted to the floor, showing the family's feet. The whispers grew louder, mixed with the muffled sound of the kids crying. Then came the thud, heavy like footsteps, but the source was off-screen. The tape cut out abruptly, leaving nothing but a black screen. I sat there, heart racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. My rational mind told me it was just an old home video, maybe some kind of prank or staged performance. I just couldn't get past the thought that it was all too real to be fake. I ejected the tape and set it aside, telling myself I'd take another look later. Maybe I'd missed something, some detail that would explain it all. But for the rest of the night, I couldn't shake the image of that family's terrified faces, the way they stared toward the hallway as if something was coming for them. The next morning, I decided to watch the tape again in the daylight, hoping it wouldn't feel as unsettling. This time, I paid closer attention to the details. The way the family moved, the expressions on their faces. I noticed something I'd missed the night before, a small calendar hanging on the wall. The year on it was from nearly 3 decades ago, decades before I even thought about moving into this house. The family in the footage kept looking at the same spot off camera, their expressions growing more and more panicked. Then, just before the tape cut out, I saw it. A shadow, tall and angular, briefly crossed into the frame. It wasn't like any shadow I'd seen before, more like the absence of light itself. The family huddled together, their mouths moving as if screaming, though no sound came through. And then the screen went black. I rewound the tape several times, trying to figure out if it was some kind of special effect or a trick of the lighting, but it wasn't. The more I watched, the more it felt like something real. I couldn't let it go. I reached out to a neighbor who had lived on the street for decades, asking if they remembered the family who lived there before the old couple that sold me the house. They hesitated, clearly uneasy, before finally saying, "I don't like talking about it." They left suddenly. Something about the house didn't sit right with them. When I asked what they meant, they just shook their head. From what I saw, they abandoned most of their stuff, like they were in a big hurry, and the house was closed for about 3 years before the last owners bought it. I stopped asking questions after that. The tape went back into the box, and the box went into the attic. I haven't touched it since. Every so often, though, I catch myself wondering what really happened to them. Whatever happened here before I came, I just hope it stays in the past. But sometimes, when the house is silent, I swear I hear the faint sound of whispers, just like on the tape. Yard sales have always been a kind of therapy for me. There's something oddly satisfying about rummaging through old items, finding that one hidden gem, and imagining the story behind it. I looked forward to these weekends. They gave me a break from the intensity of my job, a chance to unwind and maybe find a treasure or two for my home. One Saturday morning, I grabbed my coffee, hopped in my car, and drove to a nearby neighborhood that was hosting a community-wide yard sale. The streets were crowded with people, holding tables overflowing with everything from dusty books to vintage knickknacks. I parked near a quiet cul-de-sac where a lone yard sale was set up under a massive oak tree. The sign caught my attention: antiques and vintage finds. I strolled over, taking my time to browse through the collection. There were old cameras, ornate silverware sets, and even a vintage typewriter. But what caught my eye was a tall mirror leaning against the side of the house. Its frame was gilded gold, carved with vines and flowers, though it showed signs of wear. The glass was slightly warped, giving it that old-fashioned charm that instantly drew me in. I imagined it hanging in my living room, catching the afternoon sunlight. As I studied the mirror, the venter, a man in his late 50s, walked over. He was wiry, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes. Admiring the mirror, he asked, his voice calm but with an undertone I couldn't quite place. "It's beautiful," I replied, running my fingers over the frame. "How much?" He hesitated, his hand resting protectively on the mirror's edge. "It's special. Been in my family for generations." "Are you sure it's what you're looking for?" His reluctance caught me off guard. Most vendors I'd encountered were eager to sell, but he seemed almost possessive. "I'm sure," I said, smiling. "It would look perfect in my living room." He stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "All right, but it's heavy. Let me deliver it to your house. It's no trouble." His insistence gave me a bad feeling. I could have easily fit the mirror in my car, but I didn't want to be rude. Knowing better, but doing it anyway, I agreed and gave him my address. A couple of hours later, his old pickup truck pulled into my driveway. I met him outside, planning to help carry the mirror in, but he waved me off. "I've got it," he said, carefully unloading it and bringing it inside. He placed it against the wall in my living room and stood back, as if admiring his work. "It looks good here," he said, his tone almost reverent. "Take care of it." "Thank you," I replied, but he lingered, his eyes scanning the room. It felt intrusive, like he was memorizing every detail. Finally, he left, and I locked the door behind him, feeling a strange sense of relief. That evening, I sat on the couch, admiring the mirror in its new spot. It was as stunning as I'd imagined, its golden frame catching the glow of the lamp. But as the night wore on, a faint unease crept in. I told myself it was just my overactive imagination and went to bed. The next morning, as I stepped outside to grab the mail, I noticed a car parked across the street. It was an old blue sedan, its windows tinted. I didn't think much of it until later that afternoon when it was still there. I looked over, but I couldn't see who was inside. Shrugging it off, I went back inside. That evening, as I closed the curtains, I peeked outside again. The sedan was still parked there. This time I could make out the outline of a man sitting behind the wheel. My chest tightened when I realized it was the vendor from the yard sale. Why would he be parked outside my house? Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was visiting someone. But as the days passed, the sedan remained a constant presence, parked in the same spot for hours at a time. By the fourth day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, as I prepared dinner, I looked out the window and saw the sedan parked closer. This time, at the curb, right in front of my house. My chest tightened as I saw the man sitting in the driver's seat, staring directly at my house. I decided to confront him. I stepped out onto my chair. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my chest as I crossed the yard. As soon as I reached the sidewalk, he started the car and drove off. I stood there for a moment, my hands were trembling. Was I overreacting? Maybe he had a perfectly innocent reason for being there. That night, I couldn't sleep. The slightest noise in the house made me jump, and the mirror, once a beautiful addition to my home, now gave me the creeps. I moved it into the garage, covering it with an old sheet. The next evening, I was sitting in the living room when headlights flooded the front yard. I peeked through the curtains and saw the sedan parked in my driveway. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the man step out of the car and start walking toward the house. Panicking, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, explaining the situation as I locked the doors and windows. The man was pacing along the sidewalk, occasionally looking up at the windows. He didn't try to enter, but his presence was enough to chill me to the bone. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air. The man jumped back into his car and sped off, disappearing into the night. When the police arrived, I described him, provided the car's plate number, and explained everything that had happened. The officer assured me they'd patrol the area and try to track him down. The man never returned, but I've never been able to forget it. I couldn't stop feeling paranoid, checking every lock and looking over my shoulder constantly. Eventually, I brought the mirror back up to the living room, hoping that seeing it in the light of day might help me reclaim some sense of normalcy. But even now, it doesn't feel like it's really mine. There's something about it, a heaviness, like it still belongs to him somehow. I haven't decided if I'm going to keep it or sell it, but for now, it just sits there, a quiet reminder of how easily something seemingly harmless can leave its shadow. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were. Was he just an eccentric man who became fixated on me? Or was there something darker at play? All I know is that I've stopped going to yard sales, and every time I see a car parked too long outside my house, I feel a pang of dread. Sometimes the things we bring into our lives come with more than we bargained for. I've always loved vintage furniture. The wear and tear, the little imperfections, give it a unique story to tell. The moment I saw that vintage rocking chair at the yard sale, I knew I couldn't pass it up. It was charming in a way only old furniture can be. The dark wood was etched with delicate carvings of vines and leaves, and though the seat had a few scratches, it looked sturdy. I could already picture it in my living room, tucked into the corner by the window. "How much for the chair?" I asked, running my hand along the armrest. The woman running the sale barely looked at me as she muttered, "20." It was a steal, but her tone gave me pause. She seemed eager to get rid of it. "It's an antique, right?" I pressed, curious about its history. "It's old," she said, shrugging. "You want it or not?" Her dismissive attitude should have been a red flag, but I chalked it up to her just wanting to clear out her clutter. I handed her the 20, loaded the chair into my car, and drove home, excited to find the perfect spot for it. The chair fit perfectly by the bay window. I spent the rest of the afternoon rearranging my living room around it, placing a soft throw blanket over the back and a small rug underneath. By the time I was done, it looked like it had always been there. That evening, I sat in the chair for the first time with a book and a cup of tea. The wood creaked softly under my weight, the gentle rocking motion oddly soothing. Around 11 p.m., I turned off the lights and headed to bed. As I lay there in the dark, I heard it, a faint creaking sound coming from the living room. It was rhythmic, like someone gently rocking back and forth in the chair. I sat up, listening. The sound continued for a few moments before stopping. "It's just the wood settling," I told myself, though my heart was racing. I rolled over and tried to sleep, but the sound stayed with me. The creaking became a nightly occurrence. Sometimes it was faint, other times louder, as if someone were pushing the chair harder. I started avoiding the living room at night, opting to stay in my bedroom with the door closed. One morning, I walked into the living room and froze. The chair was slightly out of place, angled toward the window. Maybe I'd bumped it, I thought, though I knew that wasn't true. I'd been careful not to touch it when I'd vacuumed the day before, and I lived alone. There was no one else who could have moved it. I shoved the chair back into place and went about my day, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the unease lingered. One night, I decided to test the chair. After dinner, I sat in it for a while, rocking gently, trying to see if there was something mechanical about the movement or sound. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Before going to bed, I took a small piece of tape and placed it under one of the chair's legs, marking its position. If it moved again, I'd know for sure. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the loudest creaking yet. It was violent, the sound of wood straining as the chair rocked back and forth with force. I threw on my robe and ran into the living room. The chair was rocking furiously, the throw blanket draped over its back slipping to the floor. "Stop it!" I shouted, though I wasn't sure who or what I was yelling at. The chair stopped abruptly, the room falling into eerie silence. My eyes darted to the tape mark. The chair had moved several inches off its original spot. That was the first time I truly felt afraid. I left the lights on that night and sat on the couch, watching the chair until dawn. The next evening, as I was locking up for the night, I heard something new. A faint whisper, low and unintelligible, coming from the living room. I inched closer to the doorway, heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. It seemed to be coming from the chair. "Who's there?" The whispering stopped. I backed away, grabbed my phone, and called my friend Anna. "I need you to come over," I said, fighting to maintain a calm tone. "I need a place to stay for a while." Anna arrived 20 minutes later, rolling her eyes when I told her about the chair. "You're just hearing things," she said, plopping down on the couch. But then the creaking started again. Anna froze, her eyes widening as she stared at the chair. "Okay," she whispered. "That's not normal." The final straw came 2 nights later. I decided to sleep in the living room, thinking maybe my presence would keep the chair from moving. Around 3 a.m., I woke to a loud bang. The chair was rocking violently, slamming against the wall with each swing. The throw blanket had fallen to the floor. I jumped up, backing away as the chair continued its relentless movement. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was safely in my car. The next morning, I dragged the chair out to the curb, leaving a sign that simply read, "Free." I didn't care who took it, I just wanted it gone. By the time I checked again, the chair was gone, but I didn't feel relieved. The living room felt empty, but not in a comforting way. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brought something into my home with that chair. Now, whenever I see a piece of vintage furniture, I hesitate. There's no way to know what history it carries or what might be attached to it, and as much as I love the charm of that rocking chair, I've learned one thing. Some treasures aren't worth the trouble they bring. If these yard sale nightmares gave you chills, hit that like button and subscribe for more scary videos. Find tingling stories. What would you do if you found yourself in one of these situations? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you have a friend who loves a good deal, share this video, but maybe warn them first. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.